Chapter 7, Bonds and Interest Rates. In this chapter, we are again continuing what we were doing in chapters 5 and 6. The last part of chapter 6 was on different types of loans. In chapter 7, we will continue looking at loans. Let me start with a big picture of what chapter 7 and then chapter 8 will be on. Chapter 7 is on a real-life example of an annuity. So we will see how the annuity calculations fit into a specific type of loans called bonds. Bonds are loans that large corporations have in order to raise money for their projects. And then in chapter 8 that will follow, we will look at a real-life example of a perpetuity where our perpetuity calculations can be used. And that's the topic of stocks or stock shares. Bonds are financial securities sold by companies or governments to borrow money from the public on a long-term basis. So think about how you can borrow money to buy a car, right? You can, go to your bank and ask for a loan for, let's say, $20,000. Or maybe at the car dealership, they have a financial services department, which can also offer you a loan, right? Well, imagine now a large corporation. A large corporation may want to borrow $1 billion, right? Maybe it would like to acquire its competitor. Do you think a large corporation that needs $1 billion can walk into a local bank and ask for that kind of money? It's probably not going to happen, right? Because it's a lot of money. And so imagine if there was a way for that large corporation that needs $1 billion for some major project. Imagine if it was possible for it to borrow a little bit from you, a little bit from me, a little bit from a whole bunch of people in this country, or more, maybe even in other countries. And then all those small loans would add up to a total of $1 billion, right? So this is exactly how large corporations can borrow money in this world. They sell a whole bunch of bonds. Each bond is sold for some amount of money, relatively small, let's say around $1,000 plus minus. And by selling a lot of such bonds, the company is able to borrow the large amount of money that it needs. It could also be a government, like local California government or federal government, that needs to borrow money. And this can also be done by issuing bonds. So bonds is like a long-term loan. So let's say a company that sells a bond is essentially borrowing money from whoever bought the bond from the company, and in return the company will be paying it off with the interest on top, like with any loan, over, let's say, 10 years, maybe 20 years. It could be shorter than that, but generally it's a long-term commitment for the company. Bonds are also known as debt securities because they represent a company's debt. A company owes money to those investors who bought its bonds. And it will be making payments back that will also reflect interest for up to 30 years since the issue. So the seller of bonds, which could be a company, it could be a government, is also known as a debtor or a borrower. And those investors or maybe other companies or other governments that buy these bonds, they are lending money, right, to the issuer. So they're called lenders or creditors. This is an example of America's debt. So it's a little bit old. It goes back to May 2016. A figure I found on CNN.com. Who owns America's debt? So this is federal debt that the federal government issued as bonds, and these bonds were sold to whoever would like to purchase them, and the buyers came from all over the world. So who owns America's debt for that time, which is $12.9 trillion? China is the number one lender, 1.3 trillion. Then goes Japan, 1.1 trillion, and then a whole bunch of other countries. And there are other, investors inside the United States which make up the rest of this large $12.9 trillion amount. So this is kind of to give you an idea of who may be, the people or, the agencies, the institutions who buy bonds issued by, let's say, government. Although in this chapter will be primarily, all our examples will be about corporations rather than governments. So let's say a company or a government borrows money from the public by selling bonds, right? And so the price at which each bond is sold at is exactly how much was borrowed by that company or government with each bond sale. And in return, kind of like with interest-only loans that were covered in the previous chapter, the corporations or the government will be paying back regular loan payments that reflect interest. It's actually more like interest-only loans. So the company or the government will be paying interest periodically, and at the very end, it will also pay the borrowed amount in one large chunk. Bonds have their own terminology. Face value or par value or simply par. Coupon rate, coupon payment or simply coupon. Maturity date or time to maturity. And yield to maturity or simply yield. So let's discover on the next slide what these terms refer to. The payments that pretty much reflect the interest payments on the borrowed amount of money are known as coupons or coupon payments. When the last coupon is made, at the same time, the borrower will also pay, the borrowed amount of money, which is known as the face value. It's actually may or may not be exactly equal to how much is borrowed at time zero. We will see that in the next examples. The time between today and when the last payment will be made is known as the time to maturity, abbreviated as TTM. Face value can also be called the principal value or the par value or simply par. And in most of our examples, we will be using $1,000. So even if it's not given, you should always assume that the face value is equal to $1,000. And this is true for most corporations and government bonds. Some government bonds have a much larger face value, but unless specified, you should assume $1,000. Next, how are coupon amounts calculated? There is always one extra information that is given, known as the coupon rate, some percentage, let's say 5%. You take that percentage, the coupon rate, and multiply it by the face value, which, as was just explained, is usually $1,000, right? So let's say the coupon rate is 5%. You multiply it by $1,000, you get $50. So that's the coupon that will be paid at the end of the first year, at the end of the second year, third year, and fourth year. Every year, the same dollar amount. And one more thing that is typically given for bonds. That's the discount rate, or IY in the financial calculator. When we talk about bonds, we call that yield to maturity, abbreviated as YTM, or simply yield.